Production support for In Focus is provided by Hoosiers for Higher Education, a statewide organization of alumni and friends of Indiana University, dedicated to raising the awareness of the importance of higher education for Indiana citizens and the state's future. More information at 800-937-3448. And Hoosier Energy, providing electricity for Central and Southern Indiana cooperatives and their member customers. Information at hepn.com. And by viewers like you. Thank you.
Roll call shows 62 members present. For the fourth week, we fail to have a quorum.
After the Indiana House Democrats' 5-week absence in Urbana, Illinois, and with 1 day left in this legislative session, budget issues continue to dominate discussion at the State House. State revenue is increasing and more money is being funneled to education, but worries remain that the cash may never materialize. Wounds from earlier in the session, especially those felt by members of labor unions, are still fresh in the minds of those who protested for collective bargaining rights and those who left the state in protest. We'll talk about what Hoosiers can expect from the final hours of the 2011 session as we put the state legislature in focus. Thanks for joining us for this edition of In Focus. I'm Stan Jastrzebski. If you have questions for one of our studio experts during tonight's program, please email them to us at infocus@indiana.edu or call us at 1-800-987-9848. This month's show will be a little different than previous editions of In Focus. That's because throughout tonight's program we will air short segments about issues dominating discussion in Indianapolis. After each segment we'll get comments from members of our panel. And joining us tonight are Terry Spradlin. He's the director of Indiana University's Center for Evaluation and Education Policy, along with IUPUI political scientist Brian Vargas, and Joseph Varga, an assistant professor of labor studies at IU. More with these gentlemen in just a few moments. We will start tonight's program, though, with an examination of labor issues which raised the volume of debate at the State House in a couple different ways. WTIU's Dan Goldblatt explains how protesters got loud and got lawmakers to talk.
We're just not pleased. We've lost a lot of people. We work through GE here in Bloomington, and we've lost so many jobs. They've just been shipped away.
That was union electrician Becky Gaddis. She and other union laborers have been at the State House frequently in the past months, demonstrating for union rights. Labor issues have stirred a lot of emotions recently and created a lot of confusion among many Hoosiers. What is a project labor agreement? How are unions involved in PLAs? What does right to work mean, and how could it affect the Indiana economy? PLAs, or project labor agreements, are essentially no-bid contracts on public, taxpayer-funded projects where the private contractors agree to meet certain deadlines, avoid labor shortages, ensure a project, such as a road, bridge, or sewer line, is completed as quickly and efficiently as possible. The Indiana Chamber of Commerce has come out against union-only PLAs. President Kevin Brinegar says he's not opposed to all of them.
I want to be very clear. The Indiana Chamber of Commerce is not opposed to project labor agreements. What we're opposed to is what we've seen in recent years in various public construction projects in Indiana, which is union-only project labor agreements.
Brinegar says these union-only contracts have allowed out-of-state workers to come in and work on Hoosier projects, even though non-union Indiana workers were available to complete them. But not everyone feels union-only PLAs will hurt the Indiana economy. Bloomington Representative Matt Pierce says union projects keep wages up.
A project labor agreement allows you to sit down with the skilled craftsmen, the people working on the project, put together the parameters of how you're going to do the project, and put some requirements in there that the local community likes.
Another hot labor issue this session is right to work. Though Republicans say it's off the table, it will likely be back for a vote next year. According to Brinegar, right to work will help the Indiana economy.
It'll mean faster job growth, lower unemployment, and faster income growth. And we all ought to be supportive of that, and in fact our polling shows that Hoosiers overwhelmingly are supporting. The opposition to right to work really comes from the union bosses, who collect more dues from people who don't want to be paying them under the current collective bargaining agreements than they will if right to work passes.
A right to work bill would not mean unions would be banned in the state. Instead, closed shops, which are places where union membership is a requirement of employment, would no longer be allowed, and the individual worker could choose whether he or she wanted to be a union member. Pierce, though, sees the right to work bill and the bill eliminating PLAs as an attack on labor groups.
Well, there's actually a whole slate of proposals from the Republicans on the table that would impact workers across the board, whether they're public employee workers, teachers, or people working in the private sector. Some proposals would make it very difficult for people to come together and work together for their common interests, to try to move their wages up, to try to have better working conditions.
As the general session comes to an end, many of these labor issues will be back next year to be debated and voted on.
Joe, let's start with you and let's talk a little bit about right to work that you just heard Dan trying to describe a little bit. The right to work bill, as you heard him say, was essentially killed by the Democrats leaving for Illinois. The Republicans said they would not bring the bill back. Good thing, bad thing? What do you think?
Well, I think that the Democrats who left the state, when politics works best, representative politics works best, they were representing their constituents. And I think that one way of viewing this is it's basically an attack on that connection between labor unions and the Democratic Party. And it's happening not just in Indiana, but it's happening in Wisconsin and Ohio and Michigan. So I think for their constituents, the people that support them, the Democrats leaving the state was what they literally had to do, because these laws were going to be rammed through. On right to work, what I'd like to say first is that the depiction of it at the beginning of the show says that Indiana has closed shops. Indiana doesn't have closed shops. Closed shops are in fact illegal. That means a closed shop is where every employee has to belong to a labor union, has to pay the dues. Indiana doesn't have closed shops. Indiana has agency shops, meaning that if you work for an employer and the union has negotiated a contract with that employer saying that everybody has to be represented in the collective bargaining unit doing that particular job, you have to pay the union dues because you're getting representation from that union. But you don't have to belong to it. So it's an agency shop we're talking about here. And it's a crucial distinction. So these are basically open shops, agency shops, and right to work further kind of tries to dilute that union power within the workplace by saying that what the Indiana right to work rule says is that the proposed law that's now been dropped says that it would make it a misdemeanor crime for an employer to collect union dues from every employee within a bargaining unit. So in other words, it's the way I try to talk about it and try to make sense for people with it. It would be like moving to a town like Bloomington. You take advantage of the good roads that we have here, you take advantage of the culture that we have here in Bloomington and the schools, and then say at a certain point, well, I don't like the environmental policy of the city council, I'm not going to pay my local taxes. And yet you still get all of those advantages. That's what right to work laws do for workers in an agency shop. They allow them to opt out because they don't like unions philosophically or ideologically. And then that causes other union workers or other people who are paying dues to say, well, if Joe's not paying dues, I'm not going to pay them either. And it erodes the power of the labor union.
Brian, let's talk about this from a political standpoint. What does it do for the Republicans who proposed the right to work legislation, which got shot down, and the Democrats who, at least symbolically, seem to be the ones who got it shot down?
Well, you know, whenever you look at these kinds of things, you have to realize there's a reason the Democrats left the state. When you're destined to lose, you know you're going to lose, you're going to act that way. They left because they knew it was going to be rammed through them. They had no way to win. They're outvoted in both chambers. They have a strong constituency represented in labor unions, also in particularly public employee unions, for which there are things actually in the budget bill which take away their right to collective bargain. And so there's a number of things that basically laid out a good fight for the next legislative session. And again, we have to remember that's a short session. They're supposed to fix things that are in the budget. They generally go beyond that. Indiana legislators are kind of hard to herd around. But the lines are clearly drawn, and it will be brought up, and it will be brought up and brought up because given the redistricting maps, which is another whole issue of this session, the Republicans are likely to be in control for a good time, barring something exceptional.
You brought up the idea of collective bargaining, and I want to get to that in just a minute when we talk to Terry about education. Let's talk first about the session beginning with Superintendent of Public Instruction Tony Bennett advocating how less money could lead to better I-STEP test scores, and the House Speaker pushing to limit teacher collective bargaining rights. Lately, though, Governor Mitch Daniels has allocated a portion of the state's increased revenue to education concerns. WFIU's Ben Skirvin talked to lawmakers, lobbyists, and school officials about how they have adjusted their priorities as the session drew to a close.
Teachers from districts across the state were cashing in their sick days and personal days earlier this year to swarm to the State House in protest of Senate Bill 575, a measure that would place significant limits on teachers' unions and their ability to negotiate. The bill, put forward by a group of Republican senators, specifically lists 5 topics which are off limits when it comes to collective bargaining agreements, including the length of the school day, evaluation and dismissal procedures, and provisions which would force the district into a deficit spending scenario. State Superintendent of Public Instruction Tony Bennett says the limitations are part of a broader educational reform initiative.
We developed an entire comprehensive legislative agenda, understanding that in order for schools to be competitive, in order for schools to be able to be held accountable, we had to provide local school corporations flexibility. So the timing of this is actually part of the timing of an overall comprehensive legislative agenda.
A contention that Indiana State Teachers Association President Nate Schnellenberger says is false.
That simply is wrong. Collective bargaining and unions in this country have been the backbone of our country for a long, long time. And it seems like now that certain politicians and well, let me just say there's certain politicians who have a vendetta against unions, and they feel that the quickest way to weaken unions is to eliminate or weaken collective bargaining.
But Bennett, whose office, along with the ISTA, has been engaged in a contentious series of encounters via teachers' email inboxes, says he can list almost a dozen examples where teachers can benefit at the expense of students.
There are many things in collective bargaining agreements that have gotten there because of the structure of collective bargaining. This is not a Tony Bennett versus the union issue. This is a structure of collective bargaining where collective bargaining has not been changed since the original law was adopted and passed in 1973.
Part of the controversy stems from the fact that almost all of the reform efforts have been proposed by members of the Republican Legislative Caucus, potentially leading to a partisan divide. The debate over the future of charter schools in Indiana is among the best illustrations of the fundamental philosophical divide between Democrats and Republicans. Along with school vouchers, charter school legislation is part of an overall Republican educational agenda which leaders say centers around the idea of creating options in education. In other words, supporters of the voucher bill and charter school legislation say traditional public schools are not ideal for all students, and parents should be able to choose the schools that best fit their child.
This is not about proliferating charter schools or proliferating private schools. This is really about proliferating high-quality options.
Democrats, on the other hand, say many pieces of legislation which benefit charter schools directly damage traditional public schools. For example, funds which would be assigned to students attending a charter school come out of public school budgets.
The other factor are all the other bills that are going through this legislative session, because just the voucher bill alone, which allows parents to take money away from the public schools and transfer it to private schools, there's a fiscal note on that of $90 million.
Overall, charter schools have not performed up to par with traditional public school districts in terms of state standardized testing. However, on a school-by-school basis, charter schools show very little difference in terms of actual academic achievement, with a range of comparable test scores and graduation rates.
Terry, I want to come to you first on this, and I'm curious what you are hearing from teachers. Do they feel maybe hamstrung after this session? You've had the issues of collective bargaining. You've had the what Tony Bennett said is not the proliferation of charter schools, but there's certainly been a lot of talk about that and about vouchers. What are you at KEEP hearing about what teachers think about all that's going on this session?
Sure, Stan. No, really, this is probably a legislative session or a legislative agenda, the putting students first agenda, the governor and state superintendent, like none we have seen in at least a generation of students, dating back to 1999 with Public Law 221, which was the standards assessment and accountability reform of that session, really probably dating back 24 years, though, to the A+ education reform package of Governor Orr and then State Superintendent H.D. Nevin. So this is a very aggressive legislative agenda by the Governor and State Superintendent. And so one of the 5 cornerstone pieces is the restriction to collective bargaining. And it looks like Senate Bill 575 is on its way to the governor. So the bill will greatly restrict what bargaining rights teachers have, what they can bargain at the table, and it will be restricted to just salary and salary-related benefits. And so teachers really do feel like they're under attack. Probably public education really feels, educators feel like they're under attack because of this session. When you throw in not only collective bargaining, but vouchers, charter schools, very little new money and funding in the funding formula. Probably the best news all session long that educators received was last week when legislative leaders and the governor announced an additional $150 million for public education, and of that about $23.4 million will go to fund full-day kindergarten annually. $15 million of that will be for teacher performance pay or incentive awards, and then the rest will go into the school funding formula. But those increases in the funding formula are very modest. We're talking 0.5% in the first fiscal year 2012, and then just 1% in fiscal year 2013. And then that's on top of the $300 million that has been cut each year over the last 2 years in the school funding formula because of the recession. So we're not really restoring those funds, but educators were really pleased just to get that minor or modest level of increase that was announced last week. So educators really do feel it's been a tough session for them. And on top of this, the superintendent over the last 12 months has announced several positive outcomes for public education. More than 81% of public schools have increased I-STEP scores. Graduation rates are up 6 percentage points since the class of 2008, up to 84%. We have more students taking the advanced placement test and scoring 3 or above on those. More kids are going to college, taking an SAT, an ACT test. So some would argue that we are showing improvement in our public education system, and why are they under attack now? But then the proponents of market-based reform will say we have a government system where there needs to be more competition and choice. So it's been a very fascinating session regarding education policy.
Quickly with Joe and then Brian, thoughts on whether teachers being under attack, as Terry said, could lead to changes at the ballot box come next year?
Well, I think that this particular Republican majority in Indiana, along with the other surrounding states, Ohio, Wisconsin, Michigan, I've called it an Eminem moment. And for young people, they know the rapper Eminem. He does a song about having one shot and taking it. I think that the Republican majorities are really taking their shot here and saying, if we want to do anything lasting and we want to keep a lasting majority, we need to break that connection between particularly teachers' unions and the Democratic Party. And I think with the erosion of private unions, which we've seen in southern Indiana in particular, and of course northern Indiana, that is probably the strongest political connection right now. So I think that the only way to fight this will be at the ballot box in 2012. I think what the Republicans are probably looking at, if I'm going more into the political here, is that in 2012, the Obama re-election campaign will be ramped up. They are an effective political machine. They're probably going to bring a lot of votes with them, so those majorities may not be long-lasting. They may be a lot smaller by 2012, and this is the one shot to try to, I don't want to, I guess we're going to say break the unions, break the teachers' unions.
Brian, your thoughts on a blowback, as it were?
Well, there will be some, for several reasons, not the least of which is many members of the ISTA, for example, vote Republican. And when you've got a situation such as you've got in Indianapolis, they are laying off 257 teachers. They have a $20 million deficit. This is the budget bill, and be pleased to share it with you and let you read it later. There is in this bill a specific provision for removing collective bargaining for public employees. It's actually in the budget bill, and this bill is basically going to pass as it is. While you can talk about the extra money, I know I've talked to a couple of superintendents and said, well, gee, it's nice that we've got that extra money for all-day kindergarten, but we've already got that, we're charging for it, and we've got no place to put it if we got the money. Right. And Terry knows a lot more about that than I do, but there is the possibility of political blowback, because it goes far beyond just education and labor.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned the budget. We'd, of course, be remiss if we didn't talk about the budget. And as we've mentioned throughout the show, the budget is the biggest concern facing lawmakers before they adjourn. And even though those revenues are projected to increase, House Speaker Brian Bosma and Senate President Pro Tem David Long both say the inaccuracy of previous forecasts has taught them not to spend the money until they're sure it's been collected. But as WTIU's Alex Roy reports, Democrats say school funding and some social programs may still suffer.
With nearly 350 amendments in the House of Representatives alone, Indiana's proposed $14.1 billion general fund budget has become the center of aggressive debate. This year's budget bill is expected to increase state government general fund expenditures by about $300 million. This may be the result of a revamped revenue forecast system which predicts $500 million a year increases in state tax and fee receipts. The new system comes on the heels of 2 years of overly optimistic forecasts, which saw shortfalls in the billions of dollars for 2009 and 2010.
The last 2 or 3 years, obviously, they failed us miserably because the economy went down so quickly and people lost their jobs so quickly.
Education funding is the single largest item in the budget, accounting for about 52 cents of every dollar generated through taxes. Republicans say proposed cuts in appropriations to fund K-12 education are a practical necessity resulting from a lack of money.
I actually voted for a budget 2 years ago that spent more money on everything, but we had more money 2 years ago. Today, Hoosier families are hurting and the state is hurting, and we've got to tighten our belt, and it's not because we want to. It's just because the alternative is much worse.
Prior to this year's legislative session, the state's educational landscape had already changed drastically, with earlier legislation taking schools off of local property tax rolls, a move which State Senate Minority Leader Vi Simpson says has permanently tied school funding to sources of revenue that are highly variable depending on the state of the economy.
We used to fund schools partially by property taxes. And so when there was a recession or a dip in revenue sources, the property taxes were always stable. And by putting the property tax caps in the Constitution, we're never able to go back to that as a kind of safety net.
Simpson's leading legislative opponent, President Pro Tem and Majority Leader of the Senate David Long, says schools were using property taxes to undertake expensive and unnecessary capital projects, which were placing an unnecessary burden on taxpayers.
Indiana's been very famous about building Taj Mahals in the past. Per capita, maybe the most expensive school construction in the country at one time in the very recent past. I think property tax reform has reformed that.
The current legislative budget, like all budgets prior, includes a formula which dictates how much each school receives from the state in funding. Unlike previous budget sessions, the limitations on local tax funding mentioned earlier have placed the formula at the center of considerable scrutiny. Democrats like Senate Minority Leader Vi Simpson have positioned themselves as defenders of public education.
Almost everything that's being called education reform is really about taking money out of the public schools.
And Republicans like Long claiming the mantle of reformer.
We've had to manage our budget very carefully, but still prioritizing our K-12 educational funding. And I think we've achieved that with this budget proposal.
So I think what we've seen here is that there are moving targets with this budget in terms of how much revenue we've got, where are we going to spend it. If I could get a 30-second encapsulation from each of you, starting with Terry, where do you think we should be aiming based on the fact we've got all these moving targets?
You know, legislators will speak a lot of rhetoric about the importance of public education and funding it. It does make up over 50% of the state budget, and the fact that they will put some modest increases is good news given the tough economy that we've had and the declining revenues. But they are projecting 4 to 5% revenue growth in the next 2 years, but the increase for public education is only 0.5% and then 1%. So perhaps they could have done a little bit more there. Maybe they're being a little too conservative. Really, it is a new day in school funding and public education. education. We've become a referendum state. School districts are going to the ballot often now to ask for increases in general fund revenues, and most of those are being defeated. So school districts are really grappling with tough times in public school finance. They've made cuts, teacher layoffs are happening, program elimination and reductions are happening, and so it's going to be probably probably 2 to 4 more years before times get a lot better for public education. Times may continue to get worse before they get better.
Brian, where are you aiming your budgetary rifle?
Well, education is half the budget, and I think Terry summarized it very well. It's the other half that I'm really concerned about now, because when you look at what was cut, it's things like the state's part of the federal program Medicaid, women, infant, children's health care, a number of social programs of one sort or another, which they capped in a number of different ways. They made it a big hullabaloo about the right for people to take guns practically everywhere. And then they also, a big hullabaloo about defunding Planned Parenthood, which even the speaker has said may be unconstitutional. So in a sense, this budget is going to pass, and this is it right here. And you can read it, anybody can get it off of the internet and look at it. You can see what the money's going for, but you also have to realize they're operating within a very strict limitation. The budget must be balanced in the state of Indiana, and it's always tough choices, and it does lay out the landscape for the next election. Indeed, with Obama at the top and the very good ground forces that he has, there's a number of issues that are presented to the Democrats that I am sure they are going to run in. Whether they win or not is going to depend on our viewers' votes.
Joe, how are you going to make some of those tough choices that Brian's talking about?
Right. Budgets are about choices, but they're about priorities. They're really about the type of society that we want to live in. And I thought it was interesting that Senator Long mentioned priorities and then said, we built Taj Mahals for these schools. I think some parents would like their children to go to schools that are Taj Mahals. They're the best, that are that are providing the best infrastructure and the best teachers. I think some of I can't say where I would cut, I'm not a budget expert, but some of these budget cuts are savage. And I think they're causing a political problem for somebody like Mitch Daniels, who wants to position himself as a fiscal conservative, but a social kind of moderate. And you've got a majority in the assembly that is doing things that he would rather they not do, like cut women's reproductive health services, like cut social services to disabled children. Mitch is going to have a hard time with that when he moves onto the national stage if that goes through. So I think those kind of priorities are really at odds with what a lot of people see as a vision for what Indiana should be, including people like Mitch Daniels and a lot of his wealthy contributors like Eli Lilly, who do not want a same-sex marriage ban in the state constitution, because a lot of their top employees are same-sex couples who pay into the tax base of the state of Indiana. Do we want to be that state?
My thanks to all three of you, and my thanks for your time and your consideration of this. These are tough choices, but your opinions are much appreciated. My thanks also to Dan Goldblatt and to Alex Roy and to Ben Skirvin. And we'd like you to send your questions for our next In Focus program to infocus@indiana.edu. You can also leave a comment or see portions of this program by visiting indianapublicmedia.org/infocus. And thanks to you for watching and listening. Have a nice night.
Production support for In Focus is provided by Hoosiers for Higher Education, a statewide organization of alumni and friends of Indiana University, dedicated to raising the awareness of the importance of higher education for Indiana citizens and the state's future. More information at 800-937-3448. And Hoosier Energy, providing electricity for Central and Southern Indiana cooperatives and their member customers. Information at hepn.com. And by viewers like you. Thank you.